Thank you for joining today's Tech Talk, Implementation Optimization Resources, Dynamics 365 Customer Service Testing. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Daren, Principal FastTrack Solution Architect.
So today we're going to, as Michale mentioned, we're going to cover these agenda topics. One, I want to dive into the types of testing, and then some considerations when you're going through the testing process, building out test plan scenarios, timelines, and the resources that help you, that we put out there to help you do these activities. And then once you kind of laid all that out, you're going to want to identify your tool of choice. And then we're going to talk about some of the resources that are available for you to get started. So I know that there's probably a mix of expertise in the audience. So some of this stuff may be, old hat. You probably knew this. Just bear with us. You may learn a couple things here and there about environments and clients and things like that. But as we get towards the end, we're going to slowly build towards, the final piece with tools and put it all together. So if you're new, great, welcome. If you're experienced, awesome. If you have any questions, there's the Q&A panel. Definitely drop a question in that panel so that we can answer them. So with that, let's go ahead and just dive right into it. First, we're going to talk about some of the types of testing you're going to probably experience or use on a given project or an implementation. We're only going to cover a few of them. There's there's some different types of testing, but I'm just going to mainly focus on some of the primary types that, I've seen or work with customers on their implementation, on their projects, and that, they deliver on. The first one is going to be unit testing. Now, when we have business requirements and the platform doesn't exactly do whatever you're trying to do for the requirement of the end user, you're probably going to get into the area of customization and extending the platform to do what it needs. So to meet those requirements. A lot of times we'll end up doing, client scripting, web resources, and things like that, or even custom apps or plugins to meet those requirements that the business is really looking to deliver on. So really recommend unit testing, especially in the plugin space. That way, when we go to, as requirements change or user experience needs to change, and that requires us to change our code, we can have unit tests built in to capture any regressions ahead of time. And this should be an iterative approach. So if we do experience any regressions or bugs or something like that in our custom code, we can build that into our unit test and coverage so that, moving forward, we can capture those scenarios and make sure it doesn't happen again. So things like plugins, integrations, or any custom apps that you build for Dynamics, this is definitely an area you definitely want to cover and have good coverage of unit testing. Now, later in the presentation, we're going to talk about some of the tools, and we'll kind of call out a few of them that we've seen on implementations that'll help you do this unit testing. But definitely, want to make sure you have good quality coverage for your code, so that you can, again, push out that quality build that you're looking for. The next one is user testing. I mean, this is old school. Like, if there's no automation is continuing to grow and evolve and get very complex. But still, you can cover that with user testing. So my customers still have a portion of their testing based on regular user testing. There's complex scenarios or integrations or third-party apps that they have to go and validate data with. That makes it very complex to build automation to kind of accomplish that, or maybe some challenges or barriers. So user testing is kind of the answer for those. Smoke testing, pushing out changes. If you have your business really going in and doing user acceptance testing or functional, looking for regressions, or even testing those integrations, that's where this is really key. So now, today, most of my customers probably have a good portion of their testing done with automation for things like functional and regression testing. But again, there's still a small portion of that's going to be user testing, just from like I said, those complex scenarios that it makes it difficult. And we talked about automation. That's the next one. So any part of your project, you're going to have some automation testing. And if you don't, you're really missing out. So, this is a way for you to have a way to test your UI and a way to test your functionality and do it iteratively. Like, you can do it more often. You don't have to have those users sitting there walking through the steps. You can simulate that through automation, and you can have it run more often. And definitely identify potential issues, well in advance. So this is, again, the automation piece is focused on identifying functional issues, or any regressions, but you can also do some integration there. Like, if it all done within the app, and you can validate those integrations, or even some light performance testing. So validate things like how long the form load takes, or how long it takes to refresh a page or something like that. So those are things that you can definitely do with automation testing. And last but not least, is the performance testing. When I say by performance testing, what I really mean is at scale or scale testing, right? So we're going to do load on the platform or on the servers to make sure that anything that we've done to customize our solution is going to pass that end user test and meet your SLAs, right? And so example would be if I wanted to, we have a go live that's going to be 500 users, and we have some complex customizations. We definitely want to put a user load and simulate 500 users ahead of time before we just roll it out and expect for, hope for the best, right? So we want to know ahead of time, is the things that we've done, the changes, the customizations, all of that going to hold up when all those users come online, and you can, rest easy that, it's going to pass the test and it's not going to have any issues. So this is one of the more complex portions of testing. So customers tend to shy away from it. It's hard to put all the things together and user scenarios and how you scale up and all that stuff. But the team and I have worked on putting out some resources that kind of maybe help demystify some of that, and even get you a little bit off the ground so you don't kind of know what you're doing, or have a better understanding of what you're doing, and you don't have to start from scratch. So, and again, we're going to talk about some of those things later on in the presentation. So those are 4 main types of testing that I work with customers, or I've, talked to customers about within the implementation. Doesn't mean that's the only types of testing, but just the primary ones that we kind of deal with on a day-to-day basis. Other ones would be like, data validation testing, security testing, those types of things, pen testing. There is some resources out there for the Dynamics platform and customer service that if you're looking for things like penetration testing, those types of things, data, security, there's on the Trust Portal, there's documents that we've put out there that's been done by third-party customers to come in and actually do that type of testing against Dynamics out of box. And you can go out there and access all that. So the Trust Portal is where you can go to get that. And it doesn't mean you can't go and do that type of stuff, testing on your own. We definitely have customers that do that as well, especially if they're going to extend the platform. That may be a good opportunity to engage those resources to do that type of testing. So definitely don't want to ignore that, but these are, I guess, I wanted to call out the main 4 types of testing that we work with. Now that we've talked about the types of testing, I want to get into really, some of the things that you want to consider before you really lay out your plan, before you lay out your timeline, things like that. And so the main things that we want to cover, really kind of have nailed down, is one, our environments, right? You're going to have your typical environment strategy, your dev, test, and production, at a minimum, right? There's going to be probably more than that. You want to have what type of clients you're going to be testing. You want to understand how your end users are going to work and interact with the Dynamics platform. And, oh, by the way, the data that really, is in that testing environment to ensure that you're almost like production data. And so that when you do that testing, you're uncovering potential issues just like the data would be in production. We've run into some scenarios where, we did a lot of testing and the test didn't really capture the regression because it was data related. And then you get to production and then you have a problem. So definitely want to get as close as possible from a data perspective. So that's a concern. And then security wise, making sure that you have your security user personas and security roles and responsibilities and business unit structure, all that stuff laid out, ready to go. We'll cover some of the scenarios that where testing is going to be useful, and we just covered some of the types of testing. So those are the main considerations before as you get started for doing testing on Dynamics. The first thing I want to talk about is clients. There's a multitude of clients that we can interact with Dynamics, the primary being the web client or the browser. And there's multiple browser types too. So you'll have, Chrome and Firefox and Edge and things like that, or some other browsers maybe. So you want to definitely understand what the user base is, what your organization is pushing out there and what they standardize on. And really kind of mimic your testing or do your automation testing on those types of clients, versions and things like that. So browser type and web client is going to be key. That'll be the primary one. The next one is going to be the mobile client or maybe the tablet client. So depending on if, what your user base is, if they're field service or something like that, or they're out in the field or somebody's trying to connect, then mobile might be more prevalent. But definitely understand, are there users that are going to have a mobile experience? And do we need to do some automation testing or any types of testing for that matter on those clients? Outlook is a pretty essential tool that, a lot of users have and they interact with day to day. There's definitely the Outlook client and the integration that they can interact with Dynamics within their Outlook experience. So you want to understand what that user use case is and that scenarios so that you can kind of account for those as well. So if they work primarily in the browser client and then, oh, by the way, they want to go over to the Outlook client, you want to validate those two experiences to make sure you're capturing, any potential issues or identifying any potential issues. So definitely want to, factor those in. And then the last but not least is the USD. This is another one that's slowly working its way to, phasing out. And as the browser client becomes session aware, the scenarios for using USD become less and less. There's still scenarios out there. It's still available. I still have customers that use it. But if you need to do automation testing on that, there's some tools out there that are available to do that. So, but definitely want to lay out your client, scenarios, and understand how your users are going to use and connect to Dynamics. The next portion of that's going to be environments. And I'm going to show you some documentation, online documentation a little later, talking about environment strategy, and then talk about the versions and things like that. But I really want to touch base on the difference between what we call our first release environment and our sandbox and production environments. So first release environment is available to customers, some customers, depending on, your implementation. And it really is a preview into the Microsoft changes. So if we're releasing out bug fixes and patches and things like that, first release is going to be the first station or the first set of environments that get those latest builds. And if you're in North America or EMEA, it could be up to 4 to 5 weeks earlier than you get it in your production environment. So one thing I do want to call out is that your sandbox environment, which is be like your dev or your test environment, is going to be in the same station as your production environment. So when we talk about Microsoft releases, you don't get an early preview in your sandbox, your dev or UAT environment. The only way you can get an early access to that would be the first release. So very essential. And I'm going to talk a little bit about those stations. I'll show you the online documentations that calls that out. And you can see the build differences in how they kind of migrate through each station and which geo is going to be in which station. So definitely want to understand your environments, your environment strategy before you ever get started with doing your testing. The next consideration is really your data. I talked about it briefly a little bit earlier, talking about like making sure that you have production-like data You don't want just random strings or random numbers in there, especially if you're going to be doing searches and things like that. So if I'm going to have John Doe in my production, maybe I want to have something similar like that in my test environment. Same thing, phone numbers and email addresses. Don't want actual phone numbers and email addresses, but you want to be as close as possible. Something that's relevant and close to production as you can get. So definitely want to look at that, invest in time to build out your test environment so that data is quality. There's some frameworks out there that'll help you do some test data, like generate test data. If you go out to GitHub and do test data mocking and things like that, or generation, there's a handful of frameworks you can definitely utilize to do that. So the next piece is really having a net negative impact on your environment. And what I mean by that is if we're doing testing, let's just say we're creating cases with the automation test or a user scenario, and we're also deleting cases in one of those scenarios. We definitely don't want to delete more cases than we create, because the net end result is going to be you run out of data at some point, right? So understanding kind of what testing you're doing, and if you are destroying data, you don't want to have that impact or experience that down the road. Same thing with like, hey, I'm creating cases, but I'm not deleting them after I'm done or cleaning up the scenario. Well, down the road, you may only have 1 million, cases in your production, but now you have 3 million over the span of 6 months because of all the testing you've done. And that really kind of takes you out of alignment with your production environment. So performance may degrade as that data grows. So that's something to consider when you're looking at testing, making sure that, again, we stay as close to production as possible so that like for like scenario is going to be there. The last thing is going to be the security, not just from, data security, but also credentials and access and things like that. I've run into scenarios where customers are very loose with their login credentials and things, the personas, all that. So you definitely want to have those secure so that nobody can take those accounts and access the environments and do things to it. So definitely want to be mindful of that. To continue on with that security discussion, you definitely want to be understanding of kind of what your end user scenarios are. You're going to definitely have different profiles or different personas that you're going to want to test, right? So, example would be I got a call center agent, and then I got a call center manager, and I maybe have some upper leadership roles. We want to kind of make sure we have good coverage for each of those personas so that we run those tests. We know exactly what the experience is going to be, and there's not any regressions. Also, when we're doing performance testing, we want to understand like, hey, we're going to simulate 500 users. We want to be as many user accounts as possible, so that we can simulate that load, and we're not stepping on each other from a user account access perspective. So something to consider in that regard. And then obviously the data, the roles and the business units and things like that. So not only do we have the personas, but we have different roles and different business units and different access, and we're covering all the different, scenarios for that. And I just talked about credentials, and being good stewards and managing our credentials so nobody gains access, where they shouldn't. So, storing those securely so that nobody can get access to those. Some other additional test considerations, another, continuation of security, things like, app scan, Veriscan, penetration testing, those types of things, security assessments. Some of my larger customers, they have built-in SecArc teams or security teams, and they do a number of those types of tests, right? Penetration testing, things like that. So, so you can do, your internal teams can perform that type of testing. There's third parties that'll help you do that. And then Microsoft has done it themselves with the out-of-box platform. So, and those resources are out there online to go and get. So, data validation. So making sure that the data we have, we can validate what's going in. How that data is transformed. Maybe there's integrations and things like that. loading data. So additional testing you may want to do to make sure that all the data that we have is quality, and we're not pushing any bad data in or out. Lifecycle management. So this is also, this is key, and I don't talk to too much, as much as I need to inside of this presentation, but making sure when we talk about environment strategy, when we have that dev and that test and that production at a bare minimum, that when we make changes in our dev environment, that we're packaging those up and those are pushed through that life cycle to the testing environment, and all the changes that are there, and we're pushing all those changes out to testing so that our testing is valid, right? And we're not missing anything. We want to capture, any potential regressions, any potential issues. And if we miss something going from dev to test, that kind of invalidates all the work that we're putting into it. So, definitely there's automated solutions out there for pushing out solutions and things like that, and tools. So that's where you should really, really focus on striving towards, that we have an automated solution to push those out. Some of my customers still do it on manual, but they're graduating to automated. There may be some things that you have to push out manual, but that's where a checklist or, validation, things like that's really going to come into play to make sure your environments are in sync, and the testing you do is worth it. Okay, so now that we talked about the types of testings that you're going to probably encounter and some of the considerations and things you're really going to have to lay out and what you're really going to have to factor in and account for, now we can really get started on building a plan, laying out our scenarios and actually building out a timeline for our project, right? When does certain testing need to occur? And when should we execute on that? As far as a plan, you probably want to lay out a schedule, like, how often you want to do your testing. Internally, I know that some of the teams, they do it twice a week. So devs will constantly push changes in. Changes will go into the Azure DevOps. It'll kick off a build. The build will deploy to the environment on a bi-weekly basis. Twice a week basis, and then it kicks off the testing after that. So, and all of that is really automated. So you definitely want to line up or lay out what that schedule is going to look like. And as you're in the implementation process, that schedule may be, periodic, right? And then after you go live, maybe that schedule becomes more of a recurring weekly thing, or twice a week, or whatever is really needed. So, and that talks about the test cycles. You want to lay that out and plan accordingly on when you want to do that. Now, versioning, I've just talked about the ALM process and understanding, those changes and how they move throughout the environment. We definitely want to be mindful of all the versions and making sure that, we're pushing out those solutions and we're validating those versions are correct. So when we make those solution changes in dev, we're iterating the solution version, and then we can track that throughout the process. So definitely want to be mindful of that. And the different roles and ownership, who owns what different role you're going to be, working on. And then again, back to the resources, we just talked about environments and, clients and, all the different devices that, you're going to want to test. And out of that, we talk about our favorite subject, documentation. We definitely want to have documentation about this process, whatever those test, cases are, the strategy and all that stuff, clients, so that we can really understand, or somebody else can come in and really understand what the goal is and what the plan is. So, I know, documentation is not my favorite thing to do, but it can save you in certain situations. So definitely recommend doing that. And I'm going to show you some of the templates we provide you, so you don't have to start from scratch. So we got some resources out there that you can get started, and that gets you, a good portion of the way off the ground. So now that we talked about the plan and we talked about, some of the things that you want to consider, let's talk about some of the scenarios that, you're going to want to test, right? Upgrades and releases are the obvious ones, right? If we're planning a go live, or we've already gone live and we're planning a periodic release, maybe on a monthly basis, those are the scenarios we're definitely want to have a plan and a cycle and a process for doing our testing, right? So that we can capture any regressions, capture any issues, or validate, our build and our quality, right? So automation testing, performance testing, user testing at a minimum is what I would probably recommend covering those releases or those upgrades. So, and then part of that is going to be validating functionality, right? So we're validating whether we've introduced any new regressions. And the goal here is not to negatively impact our end user base, right? And so if we push out a change and it, breaks something and the end user can't do their job, that could be very frustrating. And now we're scrambling to try to push out a fix. And we want to capture that ahead of time. We definitely don't want to spend nights and weekends trying to roll something back or push out a fix in order to, get that user back up and running. I can't tell you how many times we've experienced that, and it's not fun. So if we could avoid that, that's definitely a lot better, a lot less stress. So requirements, any new requirements and things like that, we definitely want to, validate those. So user scenarios or user testing, automation testing. And this is also a good, area to really kind of continue building your unit testing, continue building your automation testing. So as requirements continue to grow, you're going to have tests to validate those requirements, right? So your test coverage is going to grow with it, and your platform will, have good coverage for a testing platform for any of that functionality. And performance testing we spoke on that. Now that we have our plan, we got our scenarios, let's talk about some of the test cases, right? We're going to build out test cases. We're definitely going to want to know how a user interacts with our platform so that we can build automation testing for it, or we can simulate that user testing to ensure that business functionality is there and it's working as intended, right? So, this is where I think the documentation and understanding each test case and how the app is being used is going to be critical, especially in the performance testing and the automation testing. So, we want to log into an app in this case, and because we're updating an account, we navigate to accounts and do a search for an account, change one of the fields, in this case, the phone number. So step by step, we definitely want to document what an end user does to accomplish that business process or that business scenario, and documenting that, replicating that with automation or replicating that with a performance test so that we can scale that out. That's going to be key. It's going to definitely help you in the long run. And then timeline, if you're in the middle of doing an implementation for a project, you want to build out a timeline. Like, hey, I should start doing performance testing, well before I go live. I want to know, is my implementation going to hold up to 500 users? You don't want to do that after you roll it out. And then you find out when they do the performance testing and everybody comes online. So that's going to happen well before you go live, right? So having your automation testing or your user testing. Now, you could probably get by with user testing and the implementation process, but you probably should start a plan on how you're going to, transition over to automation if you can, right? So you can do more testing in a much smaller time frame. And so user testing is definitely there, but automation testing and any other testing, validation testing, performance tests, security tests, you definitely want to have a kind of a plan for all of that as you go live, and even after you go live, and had iterative cycles for pushing out changes. So now that we've talked about what types of testing you're probably going to be doing, the primary ones, we've talked about things to consider from environment perspective and client perspective, and then also the plan and the timeline, and you've already started documenting all the test cases you're going to have. Now we need to talk about how you're going to execute, right? What am I going to use as from a tooling perspective to go forth and execute on that tooling strategy or that test strategy? For unit testing, from a Microsoft perspective, you're probably going to be using Visual Studio, whether it be code or just regular old Visual Studio. For those plugins, for those integrations, for those custom apps, there's going to be some unit tests, or there should be some unit tests built into that. And if you don't, start with one, right? My old dev manager said, just give me one test and let's just continue to build on that, right? If we have one, that's better than none. So starting with the unit tests, and there's also frameworks out there. I'm not saying I'm recommending FakeXRM Easy, but it's one that I've seen customers use that helps with fakes and mocks and things like that. So if we want to fake data integrations or fake or mock some functionality that you can't really test, the FakeXRM Easy is a nice tool set that you can go and use for that. So Visual Studio, FakeXRM Easy. There's probably some other ones out there. Again, I'm not calling out everyone. I'm just pointing you to a couple of them that I've seen with the customers that I've worked with. All right, automation. The next one is going to be automation. And from a core framework perspective, there's two main ones. Selenium goes back a number of years. And when I started doing automation testing, Selenium was the framework that I used. It could be tedious to use at times. It requires you to be a developer and have a developer mindset. And if you're going to write automation tests, you're going to be writing it in code, whether it be Java or Visual Studio. But there's a large community out there that have used Selenium and have a number of resources that you can go and refer to if you're having issues. So it's not a Microsoft framework, but it has been out there, and definitely a large community with that. And it's also the framework that a lot of the third-party tools use. So under the hood of things, those third-party testing suites, Selenium is going to be the engine. The one that has recently been introduced is from a Microsoft platform. Microsoft tool is Playwright. Now, I've made the transition over to Playwright. I've written some Playwright scripts. I've done some automation with Playwright. I find it to be a little bit easier to use, a little bit faster, a little more elegant, less issues, less cumbersome to really write tests with. So, but I encourage you, if you are doing automation testing and you're looking at evaluating, definitely go and do an evaluation so it fits your business. So those are the two main automation frameworks that are out there to go and, take a look at. From a performance testing, very limited. There's some third-party tools out there. I think Micro Focus has one, a couple others that will do performance testing, but those are third-party, pay solutions. From a free solution, there's Apache JMeter. There's a tooling that allow you to go and, write tests and record tests and things like that. And those tests can be taken and used in other platforms to be able to scale out kind of what you're doing. So, and Azure just recently, I would say recently, probably 6 months to a year ago, released the Azure load testing service, which utilizes a JMeter test. So if you are looking to scale out or, simulate 500 users, that new Azure load testing service is pretty slick. And you can do things like scale up for VMs, have different, hardware profiles for those VMs, and you can even put them in different regions. So if you wanted to put VMs over in Europe and understand, what the latency and all the impact of that would be, you could definitely do so. So definitely check that out if you haven't done that yet. But still, back to performance testing. Performance testing is challenging, right? It's difficult. And if you haven't done it before, you can find yourself being really frustrated and where to start and how to do it. But I think our team has put together a series of resources to get you started, get you pointed in the right direction, and giving you some samples so that you don't have to start from scratch. And I'll cover those in just a moment. If you aren't really a developer and you don't want to use Selenium, Playwright, or anything like that, and you definitely want to go buy a solution, maybe a low-code solution for automation testing or even some performance testing, there's some tools out there that are pretty nice. I just put a few of them here on this slide based on what I've seen customers use, but I want to call out one in general and specific is going to be LeapWork. And this is one that our team has worked with the LeapWork team. We've partnered with LeapWork or Dynamics to provide a solution to do a low-code testing automation solution. I myself have worked with the LeapWork team. I've loaded the tool on my machine. I built out some sample tests, and we're going to be pushing out those samples out to our resource, our GitHub, so that if you wanted to go and, use LeapWork, you can definitely go and pull down those samples and have a good head start. So, and I'll show that in just a second. This is kind of what LeapWork looks like. It's a really nice tool. Again, it's a cost solution. So but anybody who is using it for Dynamics, if you work with the LeapWork team, you're going to get a discount. So I'd say reach out to the LeapWork team if you're interested in that. They can share those details with you, and you can get an idea of what it's going to cost, and also evaluate the tool to know if it's going to be a good fit for your business. As far as samples, I've taken it and I've built in some sample tests, 8 sample tests, as well as some subflows for functionality that's that you're going to constantly do. What that does is it makes it easier for you to go write your own test, so you can start from scratch and use some of those subflows for generic functionality that you have within Dynamics. So definitely can you don't have to start from scratch, right? Login is a perfect example. We always log in. So I wrote a login subflow. Think of it as like a function. So you can just drag and drop that onto your test, provide a username and password, and you don't have to worry about it. So we've already pre-built some of that stuff for you. I want to talk about some of the work that our team has done internally, and we've released it out to the customer base, the broader customer base, that allows you to go in and again, get started on using Playwright for Dynamics, which includes samples. You can do at-scale testing, which includes JMeter samples, and then also documentation on how to get everything set up and going. So how do you get started, right? And then even how do you do load testing? So we have a GitHub repo out there that has all that documentation. We have some online documentation as well, so you can refer to that. You can get started there, and I'm going to provide those links. The links here in this PowerPoint. We have templates. So if you're trying to build out a test plan or a test timeline or even test scenarios, we have generic templates that you can get fill out. You don't have to start from scratch. So that's nice. And then the meat of it is going to be the samples that we provide. So whether it be JMeter samples, whether it be Playwright samples, or would be LeapWork samples, those will all be out there on our GitHub repo, so you can go out and take advantage of those. So I earlier on, I'm cover a couple of documents. Early on, I talked about the environment strategy and some of the stations. So this is our release versions of customer service. You'll notice that Station 1 is our first release, and you'll notice the version is much higher than, say, for North America, which is a lower version. So again, first release is going to be that first glimpse into the Microsoft package or the Microsoft deployment. So any bug fixes or patches or anything like that, that's when we release those on a weekly basis. And first release is going to be the first stop for those changes, so that you can get an early preview into that. Now, depending on the region you're in, maybe, like if you're in South America or Canada, or even Germany, you're going to be Station 2. That's going to be 1 week later. So you're only really getting a 1 week head start on that change, on those changes that are being rolled out. But Europe and North America, or if you're in the government cloud, those will be 4, 5, 6 weeks later after it hits first release. So this is online. This is public. You can go out there and check this out. You can also drill into these updates and figure out, hey, what's being included in those changes, what bug fixes and things like that. So you can get the documentation on what's going to be changing. Environment strategies. There's a blog article out there that talks about like dev and tests and like what environments really kind of what the strategy, you can take. So if you don't have environment set up or you're just getting started, there's a nice blog article here that will talk about user accounts and admins and restrictions, and even, some other things about what to consider from creating environments. So definitely some good online resources for the Power Platform. Check that out. And if you have any additional questions, there's additional resources out there. I think you could even open up advisory ticket and support, and they can help you out with that as well. So, but there's plenty of online resources to get started with. Now, I talked a little bit about the resources that we put together to help you get started. So if you're testing Dynamics for customer service, we have the documentation for setting up Playwright for automation testing. So you can go out there, check out this documentation. It walks you through setting up Playwright, test environments and things like that, so you can set up a trial. Also gives a link to your GitHub site, so you can get access to all the samples. So documentation for setting this all up. There's also documentation about load testing. So talk about Apache JMeter, setting up JMeter, links over to the Azure load testing. All that would then, our online documentation so that you can kind of walk through and get going and get up to speed. So scaling load tests, scenarios for load tests and things like that. So if you go out to our GitHub, and there'll be links inside of this documentation, you can go and get access to all of the testing that we have out here, all the testing samples and documentation. So the three areas is going to be at scale and automation and strategy. In strategy, we have documentation that, talks about the testing lifecycle, talks about types of testing and things like that. So if you're, looking for that specific and you're just getting started, those are good resources. And then we also have our online templates, our testing templates. So test cases, test plans, test timelines, and I want to show you a couple of those. If you're looking for a test case, think back to when I showed you, talked about a user scenario step by step. Like there's a template here that you can document those steps. And then whether you be, user testing or automated testing or something like that, this could be a script you can walk through to execute those tests and capture the results of those tests. So again, you can either document the test scenarios so that others know what you're doing, but you can also kind of capture the results and document that here. This is a Excel version of this. There's also a Word version of this. And then if you're trying to put together a timeline or a plan, there's a plan document out there. There's also this timeline. So it's just a quick sample. You can customize this to kind of lay out your plan for your project, and then kind of go from there. So good resources that are available for you to get started. Again, you don't have to start from scratch. On the automation side, we have the documents. Now, these setup guides inside here are pretty much the same as the online documentation here. But if you ever wanted to refer to that, you have it in document form. And then we have our automation samples. Now, one of the things that I want to call out is that I haven't pushed out the LeapWork samples yet because of some broken links. We're waiting for approval. We're waiting for those changes. Those should be pushed out shortly, right? Probably within a few days. So we have our automation samples, but when you click on the samples folder, you're going to see Playwright and LeapWork. And so just be mindful of that when you go out of the GitHub. And the last one is going to be the at scale. So if you go to at scale, you're going to have, again, the documentation. There's some pacing worksheets, scaling worksheets, and things like that you can work on. But it also has the JMeter samples, so you can do like a create case. Now, one of the things I want to show you, this is, if you open up those samples for Playwright, this is what you're going to get. You're going to get a project, a Playwright TypeScript project that's going to have sample cases in it. So you don't have to write, anything from scratch. These are already sample tests, and you can take this project and kind of customize it to fit your business or fit your environment. So if you're familiar with Visual Studio Code or Visual Studio, you can load up this project and go out here and take one of these samples, copy it, paste it, and then fit it or customize it to fit your business scenario. So, or you can write a whole new test from scratch. So that's one. Then there is going to be the LeapWork scenarios, and I want to quickly show you some of that. Again, we have the 8 sample cases. Those are going to be out there, as well as the subflows, like for whatever functionality you're trying to do. So it makes it really easy to kind of drag and drop, onto your test. But LeapWork is really, really cool. I want to show you a couple things. If you're in here building tests, you can start from a recorder. So let's say I start a recorder to start a new test. It launches the browser. I can go and click. It captures everything. And now I have those actions here on my canvas here for LeapWork. Really, really nice. And then I can kind of slowly modify those. Some other things too is it allows you to do data-driven activities. So write in Excel, reading from Excel, reading from a database. So if you're trying to source your test with, random data, LeapWork makes it real easy to be able to do that. And so there's a lot of good functionality. I'd say if you're interested in a tooling, LeapWork is one I would definitely evaluate. Again, it costs. There's a cost associated with this tool, but I would reach out to the LeapWork team and kind of understand if that's a good fit for your business. Me personally, I'm just using it. It's really, really nice. Makes it a lot easier. I don't have to write, a lot of code, hardly any code at all. So it makes writing tests really, really quick. And also, there's some other features that help you with, managing those tests. So as maybe things change in the platform, things are probably going to break in your automation test. You can quickly, get up and change those things. So, I think that's pretty much it. I covered LeapWork. I covered Playwright automation, JMeter. And again, all those resources, those links are going to be inside the presentation. So you'll have access to them. But if you do a search for it in a search engine, those should come up. So Dynamics, Playwright, Dynamics, JMeter, those things you'll see those in the top of the result list. Going to open it up for questions. If you have questions, definitely post the question in the Q&A panel, and we'll try to answer any questions you may have.
Yeah, Daren, one question that we got from the chat is about how all that we've seen in this presentation can be applied also to other Dynamics business applications like finance and operations, supply chain, rather than just customer service, for example. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. So Playwright, from a tooling perspective, the generics testing is really kind of platform agnostic, right? Environments, clients, those things like that. The idea of going through those things and understanding what your users are doing and how they're interacting with the platform, we're talking today in the context of Dynamics customer service. But those things would still apply to F&O or heck, any other online platform, right? So you can definitely do that, like SharePoint Online or Outlook Online. You can definitely, take that and understand, these concepts and apply those. Same thing with the templates, the test plan, the test scenarios. Those are generic. So if you wanted to use that for your custom internal third-party app or your custom app, you could definitely do that, no problem. So those things kind of are agnostic and could be used for whatever, relevant platform you're going to be doing testing with. For today, things like Playwright, the tooling themselves, LeapWork. LeapWork we're partnering with LeapWork for Dynamics CE as well as F&O. So if you're using one of those Dynamics platforms, both of those would apply from a discount perspective, and the tool works with any tool. You could take that tool and test your own custom app, your own third-party app or something like that. Doesn't have to be Microsoft, and that tool would work. So same thing with JMeter. Again, those tools, it's not Dynamics specific, so any of that stuff you can definitely apply that to what you're going to be testing. Yep.
Yeah, it makes sense. So we're saying in terms of the approach that you depicted and the considerations about different types of testing, what you will do to set up your testing strategy, this is valid overall. And like you said, many of these tools might be applicable to different business applications because they are kind of agnostic of the application you are using. Maybe some of the samples that we shared can be more specific to, I don't know, for example, the solve case, it will be more relevant for customer service, of course. But I think we can see that we plan also to expand the collection of samples in the future. So we might be embracing different kind of samples for different applications as well. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yep. Field service, sales, F&O, those things would definitely, down the road, we look to expand in those areas.
Oh, wonderful. So we are almost at top of the hour, but please post your additional questions in the Q&A panel. We will try to take that offline and include some relevant information when we publish the presentation. Let me just remind you about our...
We had one more question, by the way. The question was, any focus at Microsoft to use process mining or and translate into testing? So what I think you mean by that question is like taking things like, I'll give you an example. We take our back-end telemetry, extract it, understand, and reverse engineer what our telemetry is telling how a user interacted with Dynamics. And then once we reverse engineer the telemetry to tell us what a user is doing, we could then convert that to maybe an automation test or something like that, right? I think that's kind of what you're getting at. There has been discussions about that, right? Using AI maybe to reverse engineer or telemetry and build out what that user did, or kind of replay or map out what the actions that were taken, right? And so there has been talk about that. The problem is on the back end for our telemetry and the data that we do capture, a lot of that is sometimes PII data, right? And we strip all of that out, and it really limits us on what we can really do. Now, can we tell you that, hey, user logged in and created an account? Absolutely, right? There's telemetry on the back end that allows us to do that. But what we can't do is say, well, this person created an account and this is the data they created the account with, right? Because there's PII, phone numbers, and account, specific. So we wouldn't be able to get down to that level. But there has been talk about doing that, right? And so I don't know where that is as far as from an engineering perspective. I'd be curious to talk to the Playwright team and really understand what they're doing. But that's a very good question and something we have brought up in the past.
Might be material for a future episode then.
Yes. Looks like there was another one posted, tools and templates and advice to improve dual write testing. That's a good one. That's a really good one. I know the F&O, like, again, we were focused on customer service today. Dual write is like starts out with really the F&O platform. I don't have too much from a tool or template perspective or advice on improving that. That's a tough one. So I'd have to say I don't have anything, unfortunately. Now, I know that we are talking about that, some things, dual write and kind of the challenges, but it's mainly from, the platform itself, not from a testing perspective. We can definitely reach out to the engineering team that are responsible for that area and understand what can be done. Maybe they have some internal tests, but I think it just depends on what you're asked, what you're looking for.
Yeah, that's going to be probably a focus for a dedicated session about dual write and F&O. As Daren said, this series was mostly intended for customer service solution. Now that, as we said before, the testing approaches and tools that we depicted today are usable in a more wider scenario of Dynamics 365 applications, but our main focus was to give tools for customer service project. That is nevertheless a good question that we will try to tackle when we have specific sessions about dual write and F&O. So we will also take additional comments and try to see if we can include additional information when we publish the presentation. Before we part, let me just remind you that you have our Dynamics 365 community portal where you will find blog posts about all the upcoming tech talks. And this is also the place where you will be able to access the recordings in a few weeks. So this concludes today's Tech Talk event. Thank you for attending, and thanks to our presenter, Daren, to you, our audience, for attending our Tech Talk today. We hope you have a great rest of the day ahead. Thank you.